Now let's cross live to international affairs analyst Marek Laskiewick. Throughout the year here on The World, Dr. Marek has given us insightful analysis into the Russia-Ukraine war. He joins me now again from London for our special end-of-year review into the conflict, this Russian war conflict. Dr. Marek, glad to have you join me.
Good evening.
Now I'm going to be taking you right back to when all this began. Let's just do a historic, review of what has transpired. Before we get into February 24, 2022, which was the year that Russia invaded Ukraine, talk about Russia annexing Crimea, a predominantly ethnic Russian population. There was outrage, but nothing concrete was ever done, either by the UN or Europe, that made noise about it, which of course apparently encouraged Putin.
Yes, quite. The annexation of Crimea is equivalent to the annexation of Saarland by Hitler many years before. In the sense it was bloodless, it was done, the West did nothing, and therefore Putin felt emboldened to carry out the next step. There is, however, and this will be a running theme throughout the program today, a key difference in that Russia is a nuclear superpower, and in this sense, it is very tricky to do things with Russia. However, the key point is the West did nothing. It did say something. It did introduce some sanctions. So it's not an entire zero, but close on. So yes, that was the first stage. Putin went on to have successes elsewhere, of course, in Syria, for example, and he has had before that successes in Georgia. So this was, however, right on home soil, so very important for him.
And then, of course, came February 2021 when Putin rejected Ukraine being admitted into NATO. Biden said no, that he has to join, Ukraine has to join NATO. Putin then drafts Russian soldiers to the border. Speak to this and the breakaway of Donetsk and Luhansk, which Putin then recognized as independent states.
Yes, those are indeed the political niceties of this. The key point of it is this. NATO had a fundamental problem in admitting Ukraine in that its frontiers were in dispute. What the Ukrainian presidents could have done is simply, so to speak, thrown away the bits which were in dispute, whereupon there'd be no legal problem in entering NATO. But for obvious reasons, they did not want to do this. And instead, the dispute rumbled on. Biden, as you rightly say, did not let him come into NATO, but also for this legal reason as well. And therefore, Putin now gathered up his forces for the assault. It should be borne in mind that it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was as much a trigger as well as anything else, because it showed the USA was a weak nation, rather like the withdrawal from Vietnam, indeed almost exactly the same with the choppers in the skies, leaving people on building tops and so on. And with this, after incidentally Saigon, Brezhnev's Russia was, according to many people, ahead of Carter's America. And likewise here, it would appear there was a similarity, hence the invasion by Putin. From my side, I had already published the books about World War III coming and the invasion of Ukraine, and so I was straight on television immediately on the first day, pointing out that sanctions were useless, Ukraine needed arms, and that this was the beginning of World War III, after which the net effect of this, that I was actually, so to speak, blacklisted on those sort of televisions, which is why I'm on the rise, because, of course, at that time, the world wanted sanctions and did not imagine the war would be carrying on, did not imagine Ukraine could survive, and did not imagine that Ukraine should even survive, because many people saw it as a part of Russia. So that was the run-up. Then entered, as you rightly say, Russia into Ukraine for not just, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk, but also to do a land bridge to Crimea, which was an avowed aim. But actually, right from at the very, very start, it was to conquer Ukraine entirely. That was the goal.
And then, of course, when here invaded Ukraine in February 24, 2022. Zelenskyy then declared martial law, broke diplomatic ties with Russia. It was then the Secretary of Defense under Biden ordered deployment of 7,000 U.S. military personnel across locations in Europe. I guess he was trying to be proactive, so to say. The question of how did the war start? Who is the aggressor? I mean, almost the whole world knows the aggressor, but in some quarters, the question of who is the aggressor, why really did the Putin start this war? And who would you say is the aggressor anyway?
Well, you have to actually point out a wider picture. In stricto sensu, there is no question but that Russia is the aggressor. The question is, and this was also implicit in your question, why? And here we come to the post-war world, post-Cold War world, in which the West stated it would not be advancing eastwards. That's when I published my book and stated there should be stability and moderation. But although there was some stability, there was no moderation. And it was quite clear that the West wanted to incorporate as much a territory eastwards from the former Berlin Wall as possible. And this worries Russia because they have been invaded from the West several times. And the last invasion by the Germans was particularly unpleasant. And obviously, therefore, sooner or later, Russia will be confronted with the possibility of either having to fight or to surrender. And that was what was going on in Putin's mind. Moreover, there is a second aspect to this, that Ukraine is not actually seen as an independent nation by everyone, in particular not by the Russians, who see it as the start of all, if we call it Rus as opposed to Russia, because the original leaders of Ukraine, like Rurik, were as much founders in their way of Moscow as of Kiev. And so this is a further complication. The net effect of this is, owing to the fact that he doesn't see Ukraine as an independent nation, owing to the fact he's worried by the eastward advancement, he decides to invade Ukraine. Was there an alternative? Well, possibly. But then we come back to the business how Crimea was handled. There was no actual dialogue. It was the worst of all worlds in some way. There were sanctions, but no real attempt to resolve any issues. And this territorial border area of Luhansk and Donbass was not actually ever resolved. No one has sat down and talked about it. And so there was, in a sense, war only left. However, and please note, Clausewitz, who is the key military philosopher for the Russians, says war is diplomacy by other means, hence the invasion. So it's not clear who's the aggressor. But it is a complicated situation which could have been avoided had the West gone for, as I stated, stability and moderation.
All right. Let's break this down. The next day, which is, of course, February 25th, NATO Defense Force is activated, and Biden authorized $350 million military assistance for Ukraine in March, more additional troops across Europe, and security assistance of about $1 billion in two tranches of 800 and 200. And then in April, America, under Biden, continued its support of Ukraine. The question I'd like you to answer is why America considered it essential to support Ukraine.
Yes, it is a good question. Actually, initially they didn't. It is said that Biden, America, offered Zelenskyy a way out of coming over to the West and being a president in exile because they didn't think that Ukraine could hold out against Russia. When Ukraine held out against Russia, then America geared up for supporting Ukraine, and the question is why? And there are at least three reasons why. First and foremost, as I state, of course, in my books, the war is likely to escalate, and this is already felt by many, and therefore they wanted to fight in Ukraine rather than closer in Europe, a sort of proxy war from the West's point of view. Number two, it follows logically by tying up Russia and by having a war of attrition which exhausts Russia, Russia will be weakened. and this will mean that it will be unlikely to carry out further attacks. This is not a good strategy. It has not worked much because Russia is an enormous country and has been able to, in fact, carry on. Number three, very important, there is a school of thought that Russia should be broken up, defeated to the point it can no longer wage wars in the future. This, of course, further stimulates the Russians in carrying on the war, because if they lose it, the consequences are likely to be unpleasant, both for Putin personally and his entourage, and for Russia as a whole. So there was this third reason. The net effect of it was, as you pointed out, that Biden and America supported Ukraine as to the best of their ability without actually provoking a war by providing the munitions, which means that Ukraine was able to fight on, notably the satellite systems, which enable Ukraine in real time to see what the Russians are doing, which was instrumental in letting Ukraine hold out. And in fact, it can be stated in military terms, if there'd been no USA, Ukraine would have fallen by now.
All right, then, of course, interestingly, Antony Blinken, who was then Secretary of State to Biden and Lloyd Austin, met with Zelenskyy and Ukrainian leaders in Kiev. Why was this meeting again necessary? On May 9th, maybe you add this to that, Congress passes the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022, which was signed by President Biden then. The first question, why was that visit necessary? And the second one, how did this help Ukraine and other allies, the signing of that Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act?
There are three aspects to this. First and foremost, very important, is the actual visit itself in Kiev, which showed that America was physically there without having any troops, but nonetheless there. Number two, the Lend-Lease Act is again an act of support, just general, but number three is very important. It means that it gives the president more or less unlimited funds to support Ukraine to the ability he feels necessary in order for the war, to bring the war to a successful conclusion. And this is, of course, equivalent to World War II, where for many years, up to 1941, when Germany declared war on America, America was supporting Britain, which could no longer, especially in 1940, pay, or 1941 especially, pay anymore. It had used up all its reserves, and had not America used a Lend-Lease Act, Great Britain would have fallen, just like Ukraine would have fallen without this Lend-Lease Act.
Then, of course, interestingly, in September of that same year, Ukrainian forces pushed back. Russia called up reservists. In October, Russia annexes 4 regions, and U.S. slams sanctions. How did that sanction, to what extent did it go to impact the war, either to the disadvantage of Russia, Putin, or advantage of Zelenskyy, Ukraine?
Yeah, there are two aspects here. Russia called out reservists, which means there's now taking the war seriously. Actually, they didn't realize the West would help Ukraine and did not put it in their plans. And in general, they didn't succeed, of course, in their initial attack. And so, somewhat belatedly, they called up reservists and turned it into a real war. Had they done this at the start, had they done their planning correctly for the operation of attacking Ukraine at the very start, then this whole war would have been done and over a long time ago with Russia winning. But they failed. It's not actually surprising, because Russia is not very efficient when it comes to planning and wins, in effect, by sheer quantity as opposed to quality of decisions or fighting or whatever.
Wow.
The other aspect, very important, was that Putin showed that he was in no mood to compromise. He wanted those 4 provinces, and this is essential for a dictator, because a dictator cannot lose. Otherwise, he will lose power and quite possibly forfeit his life to boot. So therefore, by annexing these 4 provinces, he showed, and this is a stance he's kept up all the way through to right now in 2025, that those are part of Russia, and that is that. The point here is, of course, that the West has brought about increasing sanctions. The sanctions were supposed to break the Russian economy. Unfortunately, and this echoes what I said on the very first day, sanctions don't work against Russia. The problem is twofold. First and foremost, the Russians are quite used to hardship. They're not Americans who crack up when their electric can opener fails. These are people who are quite used to living off very sparse rations and everything so that the Mother Russia, as they call it, wins. And number two, Russia has enormous raw material reserves, which made it could survive. And number three, it has semi-allies, all of which did the West didn't take into account, which of course is why sanctions failed, which is what I said in the first place, in the very first day of the war. What Ukraine needed was arms, and over the course of the first year of the war, it got ever better ones, and now is getting still better.
I just listened to you now, and I was just smiling away the fact that Americans crack under little push or pain, but Russians have a thick skin. But then the point you made about the fact that Russia didn't miscalculate that the West were going to help Russia. I'm wondering, how could Putin have miscalculated that help could come from the West?
Well, first and foremost, he thought he'd take Ukraine out in 2 days. And that was the initial plan. It was the failure of the military planning that led to this now apparent miscalculation, whereas his calculation would have been quite right had he succeeded in conquering Ukraine. This is by no means a fault merely of dictators. Athens made the same problem when fighting the Peloponnesian War, and it was a military failure in Syracuse, which was the political problem, caused the political problem. Likewise here. Secondly, in terms of miscalculation, what he saw in 2014 was, if he acted and took out Crimea, the West would do nothing. A mere slap on the wrist with some sanctions, rather, which in any case, many of the sanctions were broken and to some extent still are being broken. So it was quite clear the West wasn't going to do anything. And the third important one is USA had failed in Afghanistan. A bunch of people armed with a few rifles and missiles had managed to bring to the knees the huge so-called hyperpower, as French called USA. And USA had pulled out in ignominy from, I was going to say Saigon. Sorry, of course, it's Kabul, but it's the same thing. And therefore, he calculated the West would not be strong enough, wouldn't have the resolve to, and Ukraine wouldn't be around, hence the miscalculation. It's not actually so much a miscalculation as that things didn't work as he supposed. In other words, it may be seen as a blunder, but not a bungle.
And then, of course, that supports your argument that as far as Russia is concerned, planning is not their strong point. We're going to be back in a bit, but when we come back, Zelenskyy, for the first time, visits the White House, the first time since Churchill that a foreign leader visits while his country was at war. And on that occasion, he addressed the Congress, and Biden, of course, had earlier approved $2 billion in military assistance, including the Patriot missiles, which, of course, helped Ukraine during the war. We'll probably, let's just look at this and dive into the situation as it is today. The question that the first time a leader during wartime visited U.S. or a foreign country since Churchill, and of course the fact that Biden had earlier before then approved $2 billion in military assistance, including the Patriot missiles. How did those missiles indeed help the war?
Well, they're just one part of the whole portfolio of weapons which the USA has supplied. The real-time satellite links, the missiles, general training as well as another aspect of the Ukrainians. They've received an awful lot of training for their soldiers. And so all of this amounts to a huge backup, technological backup, hardware backup for the Ukrainians, without which they could not have fought on. So there's no question of that. As to the visit by Zelenskyy, which you point out like Churchill, yes, indeed. This has had one interesting consequence. Zelenskyy is in no mood for compromise. He doesn't need compromise because he's got the West behind him. Russia, of course, does not want to compromise either, because Putin's future, his very life may be at stake, to make sure he wins to some degree. And this has meant that over the whole course of the war, starting from this visit, for example, that Zelenskyy made in many ways, the peace negotiations have got nowhere. And for example, when I did suggest on Polish radio that a compromise might be the solution, the only effect was to be blacklisted there, because everybody on the West wants to see Russia defeated, humiliated, smashed, even though that is unlikely to happen. And therefore the war is dragging on to this day, when the most recent peace proposals face precisely the same problems as they did, because of, amongst other things, this visit by Zelenskyy to the White House and its sheer importance, which you have underlined.
All right. Then, of course, there was Biden had to visit Kiev, $500 million assistance, and then the Wagner Group came up. The leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was eventually killed. Then, of course, the fact that North Korea had to join the war in October, between October and November 2024. Then Trump wins, and then uncertainty about the direction of the war heightened. Let's start from there and dive into, of course, the 20-point framework, which it said that Kremlin is paying attention to. He did call Trump to share a Christmas message, and for the first time, I think Ukraine, they are celebrating Christmas in Ukraine. So talk about Trump's entrance and how it has affected the war. Don't forget the meeting between him, Vance, and that infamous meeting at the White House. Marek.
Yeah, when Trump won, and in part the Ukrainian war is to do with this, because people got tired of him turning up that Zelenskyy is a super salesman, is what Trump called him, getting 50 billion in his bag to get back to Ukraine. And Trump also criticized his negotiating because he simply was coming out with unrealistic demands as far as Trump was concerned, and that therefore Trump thought that he could solve the war. And this infamous meeting, as you put it, was in fact no more than the start of this clash, whereby Zelenskyy came to realize he could no longer rely upon Biden's blind support with the aim of hammering Russia into the ground, but he had to tread more carefully, which is why the 20-point plan has some elements of compromise here and there, which would never have occurred under Biden's rule. To that extent, Trump is correct. He has brought over changes. However, it should be borne in mind, and there was the invasion, the micro-invasion of Russia, which you missed, but that was important because it showed that Ukraine can't easily win militarily with Russia. There was the whole business now of actually the peace plan coming initially from Russia. It was a 28-point plan. And now when we have this 20-point plan by Ukraine, it's hard to see where it's going to go anywhere, for the very simple reason is that he has offered nothing territorially, nothing except some sort of vague demilitarized zone, which, to be honest, is unlikely to meet in any shape or form what Russia wants. And this actually, despite Trump being in power, means that Zelenskyy believes it can carry on. And of course, that's where we are today.
Isn't it interesting, really, that Kremlin says it is considering the 20-point plan, the framework, but then he continues to bombard Ukraine. But it's interesting for him to say, unless, like you always say, can Putin be trusted?
Well, to be quite honest, this is all political doublespeak. All that really Russia has said is they're not prepared, they're not rejecting out of hand so as not to offend Trump, because Trump, as far as they can tell and we can tell, has played some part in these negotiations. So the 20-point plan cannot be simply rejected out of hand after a 5-minute peruse. Moreover, Russia actually always does that. The point about the Russians is they're very slow. In this world of nanoseconds, the Russians are a big, huge bear, moving slowly with things, as they've always done. That doesn't mean to say they fail. Witness World War II, give an example. But that means that they would, in any case, take some time to reply They always do. They weigh their responses carefully. They have a committee of people to look at it. They, for example, in the SALT treaty negotiations went on for months and years because that's how you deal with the Russians. It's no easy thing. So therefore, I'm afraid that sentence doesn't mean anything. Hence, the continued bombardment of Ukraine to really show that Putin means what he says. Either he's going to win diplomatically with this 28-point plan or some version of it,
or militarily,
or he's going to win militarily. And that, of course, is the problem, because if it's the latter, or indeed the former, any sort of win for him, the war will escalate.
All right. Well, it must be noted that, for the first time, Europe, NATO, and US seem to have come together to agree on the 20-point framework, whereas Russia talked about 28-point, and then Russia is considering it now. Where do we go from here?
Well, it is indeed correct that you've stated that Europe and NATO and USA are, for once, singing from the same sheet as with Ukraine. But I don't think that's quite what's happening in one sense, because Trump has changed his, if you like, disdain for Europe and what it can do. And so he's actually, the important thing is that he's agreed with Zelenskyy some sort of plan. But the plan is by no means, how can I put it, a well worked through 20 points. The whole business of territory has been simply shied over with this idea of a demilitarized zone. And therefore, Putin is now probably framing his reply on the grounds that not enough has been stated here. There's talk of an international force subsequently to police the demilitarized zone, which is absolutely what Russia doesn't want. I would envisage that Trump, when he eventually gets back to Putin and deals with it, will come back with another version more akin to the 28-point plan. In other words, what I'm saying is America goes with whoever it's negotiating as part of this shuttle diplomacy. I think that's what they're trying to emulate, famously done by Dr. Kissinger during the Arab-Israeli wars. Therefore, it is not clear that anything much is going to come from this plan. Please note that there's a background now of Russia constantly saying NATO is tooling up, and indeed Poland has received more tanks, which are a weapon of aggression, please note, and that therefore this is a further aspect which is slowly growing. NATO, Europe saying a war is likely, and Russia talking about the fact it may have to reply. And therefore, this plan, unfortunately, may represent the last chance before the war escalates further, because it won't go far with Russia, is my prognosis.
At this point, Marek will call you an expert, or not just an author and international affairs analyst, but an expert on the Russia-Ukraine imbroglio. Thank you so much for your time on The World, Dr. Marek Laskiewick there from London.